I'm with my friend Dr. Chloe Carmichael, who's a licensed clinical psychologist. We met about 5 years ago in the very earliest days of this COVID thing you might have heard a little bit about. She's terrific. Went to Columbia, got her PhD at Long Island University. So she's a Midwesterner that came to New York for a great education and gave back by teaching here as well. She now resides in Florida with her family, and she's been so helpful. You have, Chloe, been so helpful to us and our community here at the Flowers Companies and Celebrations. And I remember reaching out to you in the very earliest days because when we started writing our newsletter called the Celebrations Pulse every Sunday, we were getting queries from our community about how to handle things. And clearly we here knew we didn't have the answers. And so we reached out to really smart, capable people, a handful of them like yourself and you very early on. And you became a part of our community by helping so many people in our community. And then we were so thrilled when you wrote your first book about using the power of anxiety to turn a negative anxiety into a positive and to use it as an energy boost. And we chatted about that a few times, and we've had so much engagement with our community about your first book. And now we're thrilled to hear you have another book in the works. And tell us a little bit about Can I Say That?
Thank you. I will. I'd love to do that. And thank you so much for that very warm introduction. So the new book, Can I Say That? Why Free Speech Matters and How to Use It Fearlessly. I wrote the book because I was noticing a lot of people were basically having what I call cancellation anxiety. You know, they were so afraid of saying the wrong thing and being canceled, or even in some ways, I don't know which is worse, but a lot of people were also actually genuinely afraid of hearing the wrong thing. As you know, this concept that has been tossed around that words are violence. Some people, I think, have really been taking that literally to the point where they're afraid that if they say the wrong thing, it's like the same thing as punching someone in the nose. And if they hear the wrong thing, it's truly a threat to their existence, as if, you know, they're truly under like a violent assault threat.
We're a little dainty now, I think.
Right, exactly. And I know we're capable of so much more. You know, for goodness sakes, you know, we're a nation of immigrants. We're people who either our ancestors came here and, you know, fought very harsh elements in order to eke out a place on this land.
And now we're curled up in a ball because someone said something we thought was a little harsh.
Yeah. And people whose families have come here more recently as well that have overcome, you know, circumstances. So yeah, we're stronger than this. And also as a psychologist, I'm very passionate about saying what's on your mind. You know, when people hold things in psychology, we call that repression, suppression, denial. It's not associated with positive mental health outcomes. When you start, you know, holding things back and stifling yourself or stifling the other people around you. So the message of the book is really simple. You know, can I say that? The answer is yes, you can. And, you know, maybe you even should.
Well, there's an evolution, of course, all the time in everything. And some things that were appropriate to say 10 years ago aren't as appropriate to say today. I'm sure of that. You talk a lot in this book, I understand, about self-censorship. When is it appropriate? When isn't it? And how are the rules of self-censorship changing with time, with the evolution of the political climate around us? How does it morph?
So thanks, Jim. These are really good questions. I want to take them kind of one at a time. So as you said, language and cultural norms shift, and there are things that may have been appropriate at one point to say that are not appropriate now. And that's true. At the same time, again, I think as a people and as a society, we have to understand the First Amendment covers language that is inappropriate, right?
But not in the workplace. So geography matters, context matters. So you can see, as I was wondering, you know, what drove you to think about this subject matter, do all this work and research, and then produce the book you have coming out. And by the way, when is it coming out?
Well, it's available for pre-order now. So people can go to freespeechtoday.com and it will just take them to the Amazon page. And then it's officially going to be mailed to your door on November 4th if you do the pre-order now.
Okay, great. So fall, but we all should pre-order now, and I know we have. Tell me, so give us some context there, about context, geography. I think back, Dr. Chloe, of things I said in the workplace 20 years ago that I shudder about because it would be completely inappropriate today.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I think, as you said, there's different places and times where, things may or may not be appropriate to say. And we also all have the right to choose, not to listen to something if it doesn't seem appropriate, but to understand that that doesn't, mean that we have to squash the person's right to say it anywhere. So just even, for example, for me as a woman, if somebody wants to hold the opinion that women are stupid, right? Obviously, as a woman, I don't agree with that. And as you said, I certainly would want to be in a workplace that would not subject me to having to hear that. That makes total sense. At the same time, if people want to meet at a neighborhood community group and discuss their personal beliefs about women, fine. I mean, hey, as well, for me as a woman, I've heard women say some pretty, certain types of things about men too. So I think we need to understand, as you said, that there's a difference between what's appropriate to say and what's, legally allowed to be said by people in their private time. But you also asked a really good question, another one, which is the difference between self-censorship and healthy self-restraint, right? Because the point of the book is absolutely not that people should say everything on their mind to everybody at all times and have no filter.
We all know people who don't have a filter.
Right. So, that's not what I'm suggesting. So healthy self-restraint makes perfect sense to understand. Again, it's not always the time and place to say everything you may want to say, even recognizing when the other person's really not even in a receptive mood to listen, and you'd basically be wasting your breath. There's times when self-restraint makes sense. We cross into self-censorship when we are, which is, I think, and when I'm showing is the more harmful side of, just stifling yourself in a bigger level of self-censorship. That is when people, even who feel like they know you, don't really know you because you are holding back significant parts of who you are. So it's not just, as you said, maybe recognizing when you're at a work meeting, it's not the time to make a joke about, something sexual or, whatever. Totally makes sense. However, there's situations where I talk to moms who are, they hang out with certain moms at the soccer, pickup all the time. And all those soccer moms are talking about, trans rights, right? They're saying, oh yeah, if a boy wants to join our daughter's soccer team and identify as a girl, it's fine with me. Right. Great. Those moms have a right to say that and a right to express that. But the self-censorship is when you may have a mom or two in that same crowd that is thinking, no, you know what? I really disagree with you on that. But she's afraid to speak up. She's afraid of being socially ostracized. That is the difference where it's self-censorship. It's not just that it's the inappropriate time and place to speak. It's that she's afraid to assert her opinion.
Over the last 20 years or so, maybe a little longer, 25, the phenomenon of exit polls being extremely inaccurate. People who go at the polling place at election time and survey people on the way out, and then they have these tremendous disparities. The first time I remember it in my lifetime being profound was when Mayor Giuliani was running for office, and the exit polls had him losing, and he won quite handily. And they blamed it on people feeling like they didn't want to admit to the exit poller what they thought the exit poll taker wanted to hear. And that was the first I heard a lot about people, the reliability of exit polls, because people are editing what they say versus what they did in the voting booth. And that's that we've heard an awful lot about that in the years since. is that part of the subject area that you became interested in here? In that when people feel like in the situation you talked about, where soccer moms, a group of soccer moms talking, a couple with a pronounced point of view about transgender individuals should be able to play, and one of those soccer moms having a different point of view but afraid to express herself for fear of that ostracization that you talked about?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. That's a perfect example. And I agree with you that the exit polls and the polling data, repeatedly being way off, I think speaks to exactly that, of people stifling themselves, as well as, frankly, people being afraid. I mean, we have a wave of political violence. Even it's a terrible shame, right? But in Minnesota, even recently, we had two lawmakers that were shot. People, love him or hate him. I'm not making a comment either way about Elon Musk's politics. But, there was a problem of Tesla dealerships being, torched, and yeah, people being, literally physically threatened, even just for driving one. And so, yes, I think that people are actually afraid, to the point where if somebody calls your house and says, "Hi, I'm doing a poll. Who are you voting for?" I've had people tell me I'm afraid to tell that person who I'm voting for, because I don't frankly even know that they're a genuine pollster. You know, this whole words are violence thing has escalated to the point where, political discussions, which, people say, well, maybe they're not even political. But when we take it down to it, politics really is just, your opinions and your thoughts about the values and the laws that you should live under. I think everybody cares about that one way or another. At the end of the day, they care where their tax dollars are spent. They care, what the housing laws are going to be like or whatever. So people care about that stuff. And when they're afraid to talk about it, I think it really leads to loneliness, to isolation. And we're also in an epidemic of loneliness.
We've spoken about that here before. And what you're saying is so spot on. Just look, though, Dr. Chloe, at how quickly things change. I was thinking just this morning on the way into the office that my perception of the Tesla truck, let's say a year ago, I thought, wow, what a bold design. It's not something I wanted to buy, but I thought it was really bold of the Tesla people, Elon Musk et al., to come up with a design that was so radically different for a truck that it didn't at all become, oh, that's their version of the F-150 from Ford. No, it was so different. It never even entered that conversation. I thought, well, really bold. And I gave credit to him and to them for being bold in their design and doing something very, very different that just broke the paradigm. Fast forward, I was waiting at a light today next to one of those trucks, and my perception of those are very different. Now, I happen to appreciate what Elon Musk and his team tried to do to bring some efficiencies to government, because the last 25 years, every administration has professed an interest in bringing some efficiencies to government, and all seem to have failed to a greater degree or another. And so I don't have any political angst or negative will toward the Musk efforts, but my perception of that brand has changed because of the tumult in the discourse in the years since I first had that impression of that truck.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that's 100% fair. If Elon Musk wants to make political statements, which obviously he did, which is his right, I absolutely think he needs to understand that is going to carry over to the way people perceive his brand. For some people, that may be positive. For some people, that may be negative.
Or some just cautious.
Yeah. But what concerns me as a psychologist is when people take that as a license to, start torching dealerships or, smashing cars, or even just random innocent people that may have even bought a Tesla before he got politically involved. And that I've seen footage of this happening, where people are, kind of run off the highway and various different types of things. And they're like, look, I hate what, some of them are like, I don't even like what he's doing now. I bought this car, years ago. So I think it's perfectly fair for people to have whatever opinions they want to have about Elon Musk, and for that to even affect their desire to buy a Tesla. But where it crosses the line for me is this issue of violence and social ostracization to the point where people are afraid to be authentic with each other.
So tell me, loneliness, we've spoken a lot about it, and you've been so helpful to us. 5 years ago, when I had the privilege of being introduced to you by our friend Kevin Graney, we spoke about loneliness and the loneliness epidemic, and it was dramatically impacted at that time by the lockdowns that came along with COVID. Are we more or less lonely today than we were 5 years ago?
I think that unfortunately we are more lonely today.
More, even though the lockdowns are over, and more. That's amazing. What brings you to that point of view?
Well, for one thing, there's an increasing spike in this, terrible trend of, quote, going no contact, right? Where various people, it's oftentimes, younger people, but not always, are quote, going no contact. They're telling family members, sometimes even their parents, that due to political differences, oftentimes because the parent voted for Trump, adult child no longer wants contact with the parent, right? So there's a lot of also dropping friends, whether it actually happens in real life as well as online. I call it the 6 Ds in my book. It's
You're so good
declining.
at that.
Thank you. So the 6 Ds are declining to date, distancing, or disinviting a speaker, or actually initiating a divorce, or dropping a relationship altogether, and as well as dropping a relationship online. And, I just want to say, to me, my hope is that this book is going to appeal to people on both sides of the aisle. But to your question, Jim, about loneliness, I want to make an interesting, what I hope is just a neutral, factual insight for people to chew on and think about, people who are truly interested in the wellness of everybody. All of those factors I just mentioned, all of the 6 Ds, people who identify as liberal are significantly statistically more likely to do all 6 of them due to political differences.
So that seems to be contrary to the word liberal.
Well, so I want to address that because you're right. In the past, in fact, I can give examples, and I do in the book. There's been times in the past when conservatives have been, more on the side of trying to say, put warning stickers on indecent music, quote, indecent music labels, and all kinds of issues where conservatives in the past have been on a different side of this battle. But right now, the 6 Ds all hang with a liberal identification. And then there's also been some interesting data that it actually came out in 2022, but Nate Silver recently reported on it, so more people are aware of it. People who identify as liberal are significantly more likely to also identify as having a mental illness.
Really?
And that's and it's particularly true for young liberal women. And young liberal women are actually also the biggest group to do the 6 Ds. And so what I, as a psychologist, am getting at here, and again, this is out of saying it with love and a desire for wellness for everybody, is that if liberal people, especially young liberal women, are isolating themselves into loneliness because they are genuinely, I don't think that they're being disingenuous. I believe they are genuinely concerned that words are violence. And they're stifling themselves, and they're afraid to say the wrong thing. They're afraid to hear the wrong thing. I think it's taking a toll on them. And in the book, I call it learning to listen resiliently, learning to be able to hear things that you may not like, but still keep the relationship. I also offer tools for learning how to express yourself in a peaceful way. To get back to your question, yes, I think unfortunately the loneliness problem is still with us. And I think it's associated with some of these mental health issues that we're seeing.
I just think over within the last year, how the change in political climate has impacted the use of and the implementation of DEI initiatives. It's dramatic. And I think among business leaders that I have the opportunity to interact with, their behavior isn't changing, but their chest beating and publicization of their activities certainly has changed.
Absolutely. And, Jim, I'm glad you brought that up because, I make a fair amount of my income actually from, giving little workshops to nice corporations and things. And so when I was just talking about the healthy function of anxiety, there was nothing I was saying that was going to ruffle any feathers, and that was great. But then when I really wanted to write this book, I had this fear. I said, okay, is writing this book going to, get me on the bad side of all these corporations that have been booking me to do these nice workshops? And I said, well, you know what? How ironic that here I am afraid to write this book because, and so I decided to go ahead and write it. And to my great delight, a very, very large global law firm invited me to speak about this topic. And they said that they got incredible feedback, that people were so happy and relieved to, know that in fact, this big law firm actually had a commitment to freedom of expression, and that we were able to talk about it in a way that really wasn't political. It was about mental health. It's again, just about, we know that repression, suppression, denial, those things are not good for us. And putting your feelings into words and learning how to have dialogue. And in fact, again, I talk about this in the book too. When we want to reduce violent behaviors, when you have people that, incarcerated populations or whatever that have problems with violence, one of the first things we do is teach them to use their words. We teach them to express themselves and learn how to put things into words and settle their differences with words, and to embrace a diversity of thought. And so that's what, to your point about the DEI programs, my great hope is that they're actually starting to think about it that way.
Well, you cite some data in the work materials that I read in preparation for your book. You talked about the fact that 61% of professionals avoid speaking up for fear of being seen as difficult in the workplace. And you also talk about 58% of employees say that the workplace discourages real talk unless it's sugar-coated. And that was from the HBR in 2021. So I think the workplace is a particularly difficult area for people to understand how to negotiate free and genuine speech in terms of an investment in relationship building to get people to know who they are and they to know who they are. It seems like a minefield. Look at dating. When I was young and of a dating age, the majority of my friends met their spouse or their significant other in the workplace. That's not the case anymore. Social media certainly has changed all of that, the invention of dating sites. The majority of young people that I encounter at work and in the community, and they're talking about they're getting married. And how'd you guys meet? The majority now tell me it was through a dating site. That's a huge change in our culture in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, which is a great thing. Actually, I love the ability that people now have the ability to use dating apps. And I think that's really opened up the doors for a lot of people.
Huge. And it's all different ages. It's, there's good and bad in everything, but I think a lot more good here.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it's great. However, to your earlier point about the workplace and real talk, not necessarily happening there. And people being terrified to ask out their coworker because, they'll be sent right to the HR office,
Exactly.
For harassment because they asked Sally out for coffee or, whatever it is.
And I think that does happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess it's another question, right? As far as, norms about being able to date. And I do really feel bad for young men on that subject, because if they don't ask women out and they're not assertive, women say, oh, he's just kind of blah, milquetoast, boring. But then if they do, go ahead and be a little bit more stronger and assertive and press for a date, then they say, oh my goodness, he's harassing me. So I do feel bad. And honestly, it's not good for the women either, because women are more lonely than ever. There's the rates of women who are unmarried and childless and who don't want to be that way are also going up. So I think again, these types of issues are really hard for both men and women. Now, there are certain things in the workplace, though, I completely appreciate and understand. Again, there's healthy self-restraint. We don't necessarily need to go to work and be spouting off about, controversial political issues if that's really not even related to the work itself. And that's fine. But there are certain industries, many industries. And again, I think it's interesting. I was actually invited to speak at a big law firm about this, but I'm actually also in talks with a couple of universities to give this talk as well, because there's many places and spaces where avoiding the topic of politics is almost like intellectually stilting, because we have to be talking about like, well, what are the new regulations? What are the new laws? How are people feeling? What issues are on people's minds? And to a certain degree, that's going to involve talking about norms, social norms, which is part of politics.
Tell me about your feelings about the climate in the last this past year, but particularly the last 6 or 7 months, it seems. Campus unrest, protests, people feeling put upon, people being put upon. Wasn't just a feeling tone, and sometimes it was very aggressive behavior. How do you counsel your clients, universities who reach out to you, and I know they do? How do you counsel them how to set the new norms, how to create guardrails, and how to create an environment where people feel safe, but on the other hand, people feel able to express themselves?
Yeah. So thank you, Jim. The word safe is just like the very best key word there. So we have to talk about what safe means. And it has to refer to physical safety.
A good point, because when you came back there, I realized where you were going. Safe doesn't mean you don't hear anything that you don't like or that you disagree with. You have to be able to hear it. But I think you're very good that you narrowed that definition of safety to physical safety.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really where it has to start. And to me, that's really been the problem. That's what I have found alarming about watching some of the campus unrest. And I unpack some of this in my book as well. There's unfortunately a very long list of incidents that have happened on campuses. In fact, even including Columbia University, my beloved alma mater, where again, it's one of the places that I've been talking with them about, giving some help and some workshops about this, but where we've seen students literally barricading with their bodies, keeping Jewish students from entering a building, right? And we've seen that as well at various other schools. Also in California, Riley Gaines was, giving a talk at one of the public universities there, and she had to be kept in a room for 3 hours because I won't even call them protesters, they're rioters. They were physically threatening her. And so even with police there, they didn't even feel safe to escort her out, for 3 hours. Similar things have happened with other speakers. But again, it's an interesting trend right now. It just happens to always be, right now at least, that, conservative or independent speakers are the ones who are being subjected to political violence.
Well, that reminds me of what we read about at Stanford University at the law school. And I'm, what's ringing in my head is what you just shone a light on in terms of people who call themselves liberal being the least liberal people oftentimes that we know. And here we are, Stanford, a university setting, a law school, you'd expect them to be more on the liberal side. They're young, how appropriate. And yet they're the ones who are going out of their minds, refusing to let people speak who had a conservative point of view. So it's interesting that you pointed out that the word liberal has been misconstrued.
Yeah, and so that is one of the 6 Ds, is disinviting a speaker. But just in fairness, because I really want people to understand, I don't think there's anything like innately in the DNA of, the American liberal parties that means that they have to be this way.
Yeah, but it's a big change because you would expect people who identify as liberal to be more accepting of people who have a different point of view. That's what it seems by definition, yes.
Yes. However, I think that where the kind of little hook came in that took things the wrong way is the idea that they would say, well, we're very tolerant. We just don't want hate speech and bullying because the hate speech and bullying is actually what's intolerant. Okay. However, again, the difference is when we're talking about physical violence and when we're talking about what gets labeled as hate speech and bullying. Again, when we're going back to the trans issue, because that's where Riley Gaines was trying to speak in California, and she was, literally chased off the stage and, had to be kept safe, for hours by police before she could even finally leave. So if you want to, unfortunately, have an honest debate, say about a trans issue and like, well, what is a woman, for example? There's a lot of people that will shut that conversation down over being, quote, hate speech. And so that's why I said at the beginning that we have to understand that people may say things that people find inappropriate, but I think that the Overton window has moved so much that what we can even just talk about has become stifling. You also mentioned COVID, and so that's another reason that a lot of times people have tried to squash free speech is because, oh, well, we're trying to stop the flow of, quote, misinformation.
Who decides what's misinformation?
Exactly. And so that happened a lot with COVID, that you couldn't talk about a lab leak theory, or you couldn't talk about, are these little masks actually really helping us? Or is this actually a good thing to do to our little kids, right? And when people would try to have those conversations, they would be accused of hate speech because they would say, well, you're going against public health and what you're saying is, quote, misinformation. And I list this out in the book too. There's a bunch of things going back to the beginning of time. I believe it was Galileo who was jailed for saying that the earth was round, right?
And well, he should have been, because it's clearly not.
Yeah. And, but there's been all kinds of times where scientists have had it wrong. We had medical doctors testifying to Congress in the 1970s that cigarettes were perfectly safe to smoke.
And preferred by more doctors.
Exactly. And so the point is just that we need to let people talk. And so I have a whole chapter in the book called Common Objections to Free Speech. And, one of them is, say, about hate speech and bullying. And I explained that, while no, I'm certainly not in favor, of hate speech and bullying. But ironically, when we don't let people really hash it out and talk about, well, what is a woman? And here's why I think what I do. And here's why you think what you do. And we have a genuine argument about it, which is a good thing when people disagree to talk about it. When you don't let people do that and they stifle it, that's when you're actually more prone to violence. And we've actually seen a lot of, violence around some of these topics that have become, in some circles, verboten to really discuss. Another common objection to free speech is, well, what about misinformation? And so I bring up, various examples in the very distant as well as the recent past where, scientists have had it wrong. And that happens. That's part of science. And so we have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to debate.
Tell me, you brought up that horrible situation in Minnesota. How much of you can't talk about it, that's not appropriate to say, we're going to cancel you if you have that point of view. You're a clinician. How much of that impacts people with mental health issues, like this fellow who I would assume has serious mental health issues, who were involved in those political shootings? How much of that repression contributes to that kind of behavior, do you think?
Well, I think it affects all of us, right? People on all ends of the mental health spectrum. So even people who are very, very well mentally, if they have to hold themselves back, they'll actually really start perceiving things in an inaccurate way, and those effects, I think, would of course be even more exaggerated for people who are not as mentally strong in the first place. But I give some classic examples in the book. There's something called the ash line experiment. It was done like in the 1950s or 60s, where they had, perfectly sound-minded college students, and they said, okay, here's line A, and they show it 6 inches long. Here's line B, it's 2 inches long. And then they say to the whole room, which line is longer? And the pre-designed experiment is that everybody in the room is, part of the experiment. They know what's going on. They raise their hand to vote that the shorter line is longer. Well, about 90% of the time, the one person who's the experimental person starts going along with the crowd.
Group dynamics, which you've taught.
Now, in that case, what happens is after the experiment, the person said, yeah, I knew the truth. I was just going along, because I didn't want to embarrass myself or I was confused. So that's it's called social pressure, normative social pressure. But then there's something that can get even more pronounced, which is called cognitive dissonance. And so in that experiment, what the person did is he had students do like a super duper boring, annoying little task. And then he said to them, would you mind telling the next person that that this experiment is actually really interesting? And for some of them, he paid them $1 to do that. And for some of them, he paid them $20 to tell the lie. Interestingly enough, the students who were only paid $1 when they were debriefed at the very end of the experiment, they said, yeah, I knew I was lying. I knew it. Or rather, it's the reverse. The students who were paid $20, they said, yeah, I knew I was lying. But the students who were paid only $1, they didn't know. They just basically adapted their thinking to accommodate their behavior. They adapted their thinking to accommodate their behavior. So if people are made to go along with ridiculous speech codes or ridiculous behavior codes, even if they start off knowing that it doesn't make any sense and they're just doing it because it's a stupid rule, they'll eventually start to shape their own thinking around it. So to your point, how does that affect people? How can it lead people to start doing very irrational things? It all culminates in groupthink, which is the third and final level of how irrational and crazy we can start to behave when we're in environments where you cannot speak, where you can't say what you really think.
You talked before about loneliness and loneliness at different ages. You touched on young men, and I'm a fan of Scott Galloway, and he talks a lot about what's happening to young men, and particularly in America lately. I was privileged to be at the St. John's University commencement this year, and sitting on stage there with the wonderful faculty, President Shanley and Bill Janachuk, who's the chairman, and watching all these wonderful young people from my home county of Queens cross the stage and receive their diplomas. I was struck by the disproportionate number of women. Now, they tell me it's a 60-40 ratio, women to men who are enrolled. But crossing the stage that day, it seemed to me, by observation, it was 70% women. 114 different countries represented in that graduating class. Just amazing. But to see all these bright faces, and they're looking out at the future, and all of them with great hope and dreams. But I wonder, why were there so few young men there? And what's happening to young men in this country? Why are the enrollments in undergraduate, and particularly in graduate professional schools, declining for young men?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jim. And I think it's kind of a mixed bag. I think there's a lot going on there. For one thing, a lot of schools, despite the fact that, as you correctly pointed out, women are overrepresented in the rosters, these colleges are still having diversity programs that give preferential treatment to women, right? Which makes, to me, no sense. And they're having affinity groups on campus, right? Like, the women's leadership group or whatever of campus, but there's no men's leadership group of campus. And if the men even simply ask about that and say, well, how come the women have an affinity group, but we don't have one? Again, that's where the free speech issue comes in. That gets labeled as hate speech and misogyny. And so I think on one level, Jim, I think men are just recognizing that these university environments are places where they're going to be treated somewhat like second-class citizens. Their quote, toxic masculinity, or, God forbid you're a straight white male, you're going to be regarded as somebody that has, an inappropriate amount of privilege and, needs to be taken down a peg, right? So understandably, young men are not finding that a hospitable learning environment. But I think what's also happening is, as we've also noticed, there's been a student loan debt crisis where students are taking on exorbitant amounts of debt for degrees that are no longer yielding the same types of ROI in salaries, right? Because as the university environments have sacrificed meritocracy and things like that for some of these other types of goals, they've become less of a competitive tool for the job market. And so on some level, I think as well, young men are turning to the trades and they're saying, I could make $100K a year with some really good benefits without taking on any student loan debt, and I could get started right away and I could get treated with respect. And I think some of them are saying that sounds pretty good.
Tell me, you're young parents, you have a young son. What's it like for you socially now? You travel a bunch with your work. You're doing a lot of research all the time. Do you have time, you and your husband, do you have time to socialize? How do you make time for that in your world? And are you conscious when you do have time for that to make sure that there's a diversity of thought among the people you choose to spend time with?
Thanks. Yeah, Jim, that's such a good question. So we do, of course, have a son, and we've actually started homeschooling him, which has been so much fun. And to your point about socializing, I was
That's
actually afraid.
A whole other well to go down.
Yeah, well, it connects to what you're saying, because I was afraid that when we did homeschooling, that we wouldn't have chances to socialize with him as much, that he would miss out on social
and for
opportunities.
you too, because I see it with my own kids. They're after they graduated from school, they had a network of friends, then they start their careers and their network of friend evolves, and then they have kids and the kids start going to school and their network of friend evolves to be because you're doing the same things. I see my son coaching his son and my son-in-law and my two sons coaching their kids. All of a sudden their network of friends start to be the parents of other kids on the team, and because that's who they're spending time with. But if you're homeschooling, what happens to your network?
Yeah, so it's been incredible. The opposite of my fear has actually come to fruition. Yeah, so we actually socialize more than ever now with other families, because I think when we were in the traditional school system, everyone's doing school from 8 to 3. And then after school, you catch up, you have your own family dinner, get a couple errands done, and do it all again the next day. And it was hard for us actually to really find other families to get together with. But since we've done homeschooling, all the families are very intentional about wanting to create social
Underline
opportunities.
The word intentional.
Yeah, exactly. And so we actually belong to, it's a social co-op for homeschool families. And there's no academic side to it whatsoever. It's just 100%. We put, there's a really cool computer system where you can throw a social event on the calendar and everybody sees it and signs up. I mean, we've never had more kids and families over to our house and been over to more other social events since when we started homeschooling. As far as just like personal double dates for my husband and me, or for individual, social time for me, I've actually used technology for that, Bumble. So the Bumble app, which used to be just for dating, they actually started a platonic friendship wing. And so when I moved to Florida, I didn't know anybody here. And so I joined the Bumble app on the friendship side, obviously, as a married woman.
Well, I would hope if you corrected that bad behavior of yours.
Yeah. But no, I have a bunch of girlfriends here now, because it turns out there was a bunch of, women that were thinking we might want to get together.
I'm thrilled to hear that. I didn't know that existed, but I wondered why it didn't. But now I know it does.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, through church and different people we meet, my husband and I do a lot of double dates. But, as far as diversity of thought, I think that is such a good question. And honestly, it's something I've loved about coming to Florida, is that there's people here that have loved DeSantis, hate DeSantis, and people get together and they talk about it and they don't ostracize each other over it the way that I observed would happen in New York, it was not at all uncommon for me to hear people say things like, well, if somebody voted for so-and-so, they're out. I'm not having those people in my life. There's more of a mutual toleration. And I think that makes everybody all the richer.
I mean, you remember in New York, you picked your neighborhood sometimes because of your politics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you'd be scared to wear a certain type of t-shirt,
Exactly.
or anything, or, heaven forbid somebody wear the red hat,
What when in doing the work for this book, obviously you're working all the time, and all of that work product goes into your body of thought, which emerges as, can I say that, the book you have coming out in the fall that we can pre-order today. What surprised you most in your work for this book?
I think what surprised me was actually a little bit of the premise of the book. So when I moved to Florida, it was because we didn't want to mask my then 3-year-old son, and there was no other way to do it, really, to be able to put him in a group environment.
So you moved because of politics?
Not because of politics, because I didn't want to mask my son. I lived in New York very happily for 20 years without any issues of politics. It was truly about not wanting to mask my 3-year-old son for 8 hours a day as he was getting ready to go to preschool for his first time out of the house all day. I said, I can't have his first time out of the house all day be where nobody can see his face and he can't see anybody else's face. And I just didn't either feel like I could keep him in my home all day for years, So it wouldn't be good for him. So I wrote a blog about all the reasons as a psychologist why I was concerned about masking children this way. And I showed it to some colleagues and I said, am I missing something here? Should I not publish this? Is it going to embarrass me? Am I missing? And they read it and they said, no.
So you were self-censoring.
Yeah. But get what they said. They said, no, everything you wrote here makes perfect sense, but you shouldn't share it because it could discourage people from masking their children, which made no sense to me. So I went ahead and published it, moved to Florida. And then I noticed once I shared that blog and was here in Florida and I was talking to people on all sides of the aisle, my own mental process opened up. And that's, Jim, what surprised me was more the premise of noticing that by talking freely and being around other people that were talking freely, my own thinking deepened and my self-awareness deepened. So that was actually like the aha moment that prompted me to write the book.
That's not at all surprising. Did you have any anxious moments in getting ready to publish? And what did you do with that anxiety?
Well, I got dropped by my agent for one thing.
No.
Yeah. So
what kind of fool is this?
Well, thank you. I actually ended up finding another really great publisher, at least. And then once I had a book deal, then I was able to find another agent. They always want to pick you up after you have the book deal, right? The publishing world as well, ironically, doesn't seem to be super excited about the free speech flag, which, you would think that they would. But Skyhorse Publishing, which did Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s recent book, is actually publishing my book. And I'm very thankful to them for doing that.
Well, it's a really intriguing title. And as you've revealed for us today, it can go in so many different directions. It's a conversation starter. And it's a conversation starter about something that's very important to all of us, especially in a social media age that we all live in that's becoming more and more complicated. And the last thing I'll ask you about is, how do we deal with anonymity? You have an 8.5-year-old son who's soon going to be exposed to social communications. Bullying is a real issue because of anonymity and beyond. But how are you thinking about preparing him for dealing with a electronically social world?
Well, so I will mention Jonathan Haidt, who is an incredible, psychologist. And really based on his book, as well as just, I think, my own general maternal intuition, my son's not going to be on social media, and until, frankly,
40,
until he's
45.
like 18. Yeah. I mean, when he's going to buy his own cell phone and pay the bill on it himself, then he can sign up for a social media account if he wants to. But it's a great point about anonymity, as well as, even the positive feedback. People can get addicted to the positive feedback online, even though it's, all from anonymous sources. And even me, I can personally get a little drawn into, that kind of thing online. And I didn't grow up with social media. I have a foundation of myself without that. And so I certainly want the very same thing for my son. My hope is that by the time he reaches that age, he'll say, I don't really need social media, but I guess we'll see.
So when will you allow him to have his first mobile phone?
So if there's a time when I believe for whatever reason that he needs a phone that I can call and reach him at any moment, it will be a dumb phone. It will be a flip phone. Yeah, there's no reason on earth, for him to, have access to a screen and to be doing things online with the world literally in his pocket. At this point, I don't have a plan of an exact age where he'll get a, flip phone. Because he's only 8.5. So it just hasn't even come up although, it's incredible. I read some study saying, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think I read that 1 in 4 8-year-olds now has, some kind of a mobile device,
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah. I hope I'm wrong, but
it sounds like it's probably right, but shocking, but right.
It is. It really is. Yeah. But he doesn't have any of that kind of stuff. I'm a mean mom.
Dr. Chloe, it's always a treat to chat with you. You're so smart about so many things, and we learn a lot. And I just enjoy our conversation. Our friends in the audience who'd like to talk to you professionally about the workshops you do, the speaking engagements you do, the consulting you do for universities and companies and law firms all over the country, how would they get in touch with you?
Thank you so much. Yeah, they can go to drchloe.com, just drchloe.com. And if they just want to go straight to the book, they can go to freespeechtoday.com.
Well, I think a lot of people should and will be running to pre-order that book and get it delivered to them in November. And in the meantime, I think I know you already have a very, very busy calendar with engagements and all the work that you do. And I think it's only going to get busier because you have so much to bring to the table. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today, Dr. Chloe.
Thank you so much, Jim. It is such an honor to have been able to connect with you about this. And thank you so much for all that you are doing and all the positivity and information and knowledge that you bring to the world through all the various things you do, through the celebrations and newsletter and all the other things that you do and share with the world. So thank you, Jim.
Well, I'll be ordering multiple copies because I have a wife and 3 kids who all want to read this book too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Dr. Chloe.
Thanks. Take care.